Kristen, thank you so much for having me back. Anja, thank you for being my partner then and now and even before. And it's lovely to have everyone here together. Thank you all for joining from quite so many time zones. This is pretty impressive. We're about 10 or 11 in this room and then all of you online. So thank you so much for joining us. Today, as we put together the program, we had this challenge of our handbook had some organization that made sense for telling the story of grounded normative theory and for offering an introduction to the field for those who were not familiar with it. But of course, we did not arrange ourselves globally according to the chapter and section organization of the handbook. So we thematically reorganized ourselves to enable to share this work with those of us in the room and online today, but also those who will be observing these recordings later. So today we have three panelists from the title of today's session is Challenging Norms. And the contributors to this first session come from the theory section, Sung-Moon Kim from City University of Hong Kong. From the methodology section, Lisa Herzog, who is actually herself a former HES fellow. And currently, are you on the board, Lisa? Of HES? Yes, exactly. So a long tradition of being involved with HES. And then Paul Apostolides is not online, so we'll see what whether he's able to join us or not. But our chair for this session is Anja. And I think we'll start off with Sung-Moon. Do you want to say something before we start, Anja?
Yeah, I think first of all, welcome everybody. Hello, it's nice to see you, and it reminds me of when we did another handbook on norms, and this was first kind of I think 5 or 6 years ago, when we also had 5 different time zones, and this was just sort of the first kind of Corona lockdown, and it was quite amazing how the technicalities worked then in comparison to now. I should say I'm the editor of 2 sections in the handbook. One is Local Path to Climate Justice, which we hear about a little later, and then Change in Norms. And the what we're talking now is the change in norms, if I get it right, yeah, Brooke. And the interesting aspect here is that we are kind of at the boundary between international relations and philosophy and political theory, and this really enables a new approach to doing norm research. The methodology is I feel much more comfortable with kind of this methodology that doesn't look at one norm as a stable thing that structures sort of agency and behavior, but as something that is changing through practice. And here we really, and we'll hear that from our contributors in a moment, the reference to the 4 leading principles of grounded normative theory: comprehensiveness, recursivity, attentiveness, and epistemic accountability. That really enables sort of going into the field, zooming into the action, and sort of bringing about the revised meaning of concepts in an productive way. So we're looking forward to our first contributor, which is that's Sung-Moon Kim. Hello, can you hear us well?
Yeah, sure. Good.
The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. So do I have about 10 minutes? Okay, good. Anyhow, Brooke, good to see you. Okay, I guess most of you are not very familiar with Confucianism or Confucian political theory. I think maybe Brooke might be only one of very few scholars working in the North America actively paying attention to the development of the field. But like it or not, or believe it or not, Confucian political theory has been one of the most vibrant subfields in Anglophone political theory for the past 30 or 20 years or so. And it has very complicated origin. But let me start with Huntington and Fukuyama. Actually, the many philosophers and political theorists in this part of the world, East Asia and beyond, have been actively looking for and exploring the idea and practice of a Confucian democracy as a new normative idea that is best suited in the East Asian context after the global, dissemination of the ideas of a class of civilizations in the end of history or early 1990s, And that prompted a lot of local scholars and scholars' interest in the localizing political theory in the West to take seriously the idea of Confucian democracy as a mode of democracy that makes sense in the East Asian context. Uh, Huntington, in his famous book, A Third Wave, writes that the idea of a Confucian democracy is a contradiction in terms. And that made a lot of local scholars and political theorists in particular quite puzzled and for some upset because East Asians have been struggling to change their regime for the past you know, 7 years, struggling with authoritarian regime, one-man dictatorship, one party, dictatorship, all kinds of problems authoritarian regimes have been trying to make our regime better. But then when Taiwanese, South Koreans in late 1970s, 80s finally achieved what social scientists call democratization by taking to the streets and shedding their blood and finally change the regime. But then we hear from some of the most cosmetically successful Harvard professors or Hopkins saying that, East Asian couldn't, or non-Western people couldn't have authentic democracy because you don't have prerequisites like a civil society, liberalism, individualism, Christianity, and things like that. Again, that prompted people like me, as a young the undergrad student, to take this challenge seriously. Look, we struggle for democracy because we want to have just and democratic government, but we didn't want to become like Americans or Germans or British people by simply creating this great congruence between software of our way of life, our culture on the one hand, and the democratic and constitutional institutions that we have implanted from the West. So what kind of democracy we want to have for us? Because our cousins, uncles, and friends struggled for democracy, not knowing what kind of a political life, public life they would live under once we had successfully or miraculously achieved the real democracy, overcoming this nominal democracy. So that was one of the questions. Again, I ventured into this field, and then we have mushrooming of your ideas and theories and frameworks published by both philosophers and political theorists. Especially for the past 20 years, many people who want to advance democracy in the East Asia context theorize the idea of Confucian democracy, particularly with reference to ancient Confucian classical text. Because, we want to present democracy, but the source is Confucianism. But then what could be our normative and philosophical inspirations? And that invited a lot of philosophers and normative theorists to go back to or revisit our ancient canon and driving certain ideas that they think tally with the best practice of democracy, whatever forms, communitarian democracy, participatory democracy, electoral democracy, and then we mix or creatively juggle and mix best components of Confucianism from the text and philosophical tradition on the one hand, and best practice that we noted in the Western modern contemporary political theory, creating variety of kinds of ideas: Confucian civil society, Confucianism and human rights, Confucianism and distributive justice, Confucianism and freedom, equality, and again, constitutionalism, democracy, and most recently, Confucian political meritocracy of the sort, that is most well connected with Daniel Bell's the idea of China model. Anyhow, so many of my friends in the field have been actively looking for ideas of Confucian democracy by looking out the philosophical resources in the text, and then they paid renewed attention. Ritual. Look, Confucians were Chinese East Asians who are embedded in Confucian philosophical and cultural tradition are not atomistic individuals. We reject Cartesian individualism. We reject right-bearing individualism. Rather, we would take full advantage of the idea and practice of ritual, which understands human beings as interbeings or relational selves rather than atomistic autonomous selves. So, ritual provides us a lot of insight about how to build the community and the kind of self that is in symbiotic relationship with the communal growing. It's not like only individual versus a society, or individual versus other people. Rather, we can promote both communal growth and personal growth through making through paying full attention to our relational self, which is basically mediated through ritual. And again, I mean, there are a lot of attention to harmony and the mediation rather than litigation. All these things. I'm not going to rehearse all these familiar things. And so the one of the best, most fashionable things back then was to create Confucian democracy in communitarian fashion. Of course, 1980s and early 1990s, still the liberal communitarian debate was still fashionable. So many people were framing the idea of democracy with reference to that debate. Now, one of the problems, of course, with this way to develop Confucian democracy, again, I have no problem with this way to explore and develop Confucian democracy, or Confucian political theory for that matter. But still, who are the audience? Look, you have your own vision for democracy, and you have your own vision for or interpretation of a text and Confucianism in general, or cultural or philosophical tradition, and you can derive best components from here and best components from there, and mix and present that as your most ideal normative vision of a certain political entity to the people. But who are the people here? Of course, I don't want to be sarcastic here, but if you go to Harvard and Princeton or Berkeley and then presenting your ideas who are to the audience who have nothing to do with the Confucianism or China or East Asia, who are embedded in Rojan, Dworkinian, or Rajan culture, they found this idea fascinating. Okay, so you guys are opening up our eyes and trying to nurture us to look at a very unfamiliar yet interesting ways to look at not only world but also political theory. Then again, you get published, you get invited to all these kind of symposiums or conferences talking about justice, human rights, and democracy, equality, freedom from Confucian perspective, or Muslim perspective, or Ubuntu perspective, all these things. And we have again, lots of publications produced for the past 20 years. The problem again is that it still isolates what you do from the people, again, who had struggled for democracy, for collectible life, who are still struggling with the way, the life that they want to live or under or live with. So as a political theorist, what I think is more productive, again, I don't deny the way my fellow friends and myself to a certain degree have been doing wholesale. But I think as a political theorist, as far as a grounded, engaged political theory is concerned, the better way to conduct or explore Confucian political theory, or East Asian political theory for that matter, is to look at the hybrid identity that defines us, the Koreans, Chinese, and Taiwanese, Japanese, Vietnamese, who survived colonialism, civil war, divided country, living in the complex intersections between tradition and modernity. And if we start from who we are by looking at our law, criminal law, for instance, in Korea, we still have defamation, not only defamation, but also insult law, which is based on abstract judgment of yourself, is still within the criminal jurisdiction, not civil disputes, anything else. Okay, so while we are promoting right to freedom of expression and speech, conscience, and thought and religion, how can we both when you are living in a country where you are boasting of a robust democracy in South Korea, championing BTS, all these K-pops. On the other hand, you're valorizing all these liberal freedoms, and which are constitutionalized, very beloved and proud Constitution. At the same time, as I just mentioned, we criminalize people who defame you, not only defame you, but people you make you upset based on certain abstract remark about you that you insert criminally. So how can I juggle these things? So I think that's very important. How can we have a communal kind of a family-like identity that is still upheld in constitutional jurisprudence and public moral reasoning and public discourse on the one hand, and the formal liberal constitutional democracy that according to which we govern ourselves and by which we impeach our sitting president. How can we have both? I think that is extremely important to develop confessional East Asian democracy that makes sense to not only to people like me who received the PhD from the States coming back home and preaching what my teachers have to say about political theory, but rather political theory that makes sense to my parents, their parents, and my children and their children, so that we can have robust collective self-determination, self-government for us. The democracy that makes sense to us, democracy of the people and by the people. The democracy that we don't understand, we cannot make sense of, cannot be democracy by us and for us. So I think at the end of the day, Confucianism can provide us with a lot of philosophical, normative, cultural insight to explore and navigate a variety of interesting ideas. They can challenge it, but also they can accommodate, they can reappropriate Western liberal democratic constitutional practices. But at the same time, looking at who we are, through from anthropological perspective, from ethnographic perspective, from legal anthropological perspective, that can enable us to develop more rich and grounded political theory that can actually help and resonate with the young people in Asia. If you talk about Confucianism, a lot of young people, especially women, female students, female ladies, hate the idea because they think, they know what kind of rituals that constrain and oppress their mothers and their aunties and themselves right now. And a lot of people in East Asia refuse to get married. Once they got married, they refuse to give birth to a child. The fertility rate in this part of the world, in South Korea and Seoul, here in Hong Kong, the lowest in the world. Why? Because the tradition has been disconnected from the way we conduct our lives. Again, so I think the best way to ground and engage political theory in this part of the world is to look at us, who we are, and reconnect who we are with our tradition. I think that's one of the best ways to conduct political theory. I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sungwon Kim. I like this theme of democracy without the West or unlike the West. I think my colleagues in international relations would turn this into another turn, but here we have it right at the center, and I think it's a great start for this discussion. And now we move the ball back into the European camp, shall we say, and Lisa Herzog from Groningen is taking the floor. Lisa.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, let me take inspiration by Sungwon Kim and also start by saying what I was against when I started out as a theorist. And that was very much economics. And I had studied economics, but it was very clear that the methodologies, the assumptions about human behavior, human nature, everything was so different from philosophy, which I had also studied. And so the very question that I set out with, namely, somehow, how can I think about the economy in a way that makes it, that aligns it with philosophical values? So what would it mean to really apply justice to the labor market? What does it mean to really think about democracy as a principle that also matters for finance, for example? I came to a point where I realized that economic theories are really not helpful because they are so abstract. And this was around the time when the big financial crisis happened, 2008, when I just had got my economics degree, and I realized lots of the theories really don't work. It's not just me having doubts, it's a fundamental methodological issue about how economics theorizes, where things are really not going well and they fail to capture reality in a way that allows someone like me, and I mean, there's a whole bunch of us who want to theorize economic justice and economic democracy, to really understand reality in, yeah, what you could call a grounded way. We did not use this vocabulary at the time, but the search was always very much for the right balance between being realistic about what's possible, so not being completely utopian. That felt a little bit too easy in a way. Building utopias is nice, but it's also not really getting at the problems on the ground. But then the other risks on the other side is that you become too realistic in the sense that you become too accommodating to the current structures and you take things for granted that you shouldn't take for granted. And so the methodological challenge that I started out with was very much this question of how can we find the right way between criticizing the current economic system, but that then not only from a sort of high up ideal theory utopian picture, but in a way that also takes certain features of human behavior and so on seriously. And that for me was very much the desire to really ground theories of economic justice in the institutional realities, the practices that we see on the ground. And it was a kind of funny parallel development that in the circles that I mostly moved in, we used the term ethnographic sensibility at the beginning, not the term grounded theory. And there were, one could have discussions about what exactly, if any, are the differences. But I think in spirit, it's very similar in the sense that there's a desire to connect to real people, connect to people who struggle, connect to sort of all the implicit theoretical ideas that are already embedded in practices and institutions and that shape what's going on and that we need to take into account if we want to theorize about alternatives. And so I was very happy when I saw that there was also this movement of grounded theory, which I think started out in a slightly different place and it has more of the international dimension. But I think it was both very much aligned and also both very much a movement against abstract theorizing that would only start from this ideal theorizing picture where you develop abstract principles. And um, in a sense, I also felt at the time that the true intellectual conflicts are not so much at a certain level of abstract principles, because among theorists who would really be against democracy or against freedom or against justice, the point is more that people actually mean different things, and you only really see what they mean if you talk about instances where these principles are embedded or fail to be embedded in concrete practices. So in my contribution to the handbook, I reflect a little bit on what this means for exploring sort of three groups of people. Just as a rhetorical move, I call the good, the bad, and the indifferent. So by the good, I mean actors on the ground who act as moral pioneers and try out different economic practices and institutions. That's also very much in line with the Realistic Utopias project by Eric Olin Wright. And it concerns things like worker cooperatives, experiments with unconditional basic income, these kinds of progressive practices where it's very easy for researchers to get access, there are sort of aligned values, and the risk is maybe not so much that you somehow don't understand what's going on, but more that you have too much sympathy for these actors on the ground and you become too much sort of drawn into these movements and you maybe overlook that each of these cases has its specific preconditions and may not be so easy to generalize. But that's a kind of research which is a lot of fun to do. And I'm still engaged in projects that would follow on roughly that line. So it's often in my current work, but there's a certain philosophy of work, it's together with unions, together with activists who fight for better working conditions and so on. But from a systematic perspective, I would say that it's also very important to understand what the obstacles to change are. And that would be the bad, the group of those actors who resist current changes. And to understand better why that is. Why do they resist? What exactly is behind this? And what are actually valid arguments and what are just rationalizations or excuses that are meant to protect someone's own privilege. And that's something that I'm still thinking about a lot, but I haven't actually had the opportunity to try to do more of that kind of work. And from what I've experienced in past projects, that's an area where access is rather difficult. So we had a project on ethics and finance, and people in banks are not very keen to talk to philosophers about how they see the world and how exactly they could imagine alternative economic systems. So I ended up working with one of these alternative banks that had already, a good agenda. But sometimes I think this is actually a missed opportunity or a branch of theorizing that we should try to engage in more, because it could really help us to understand better what the obstacles are, what the political power relations are, how these people manage to keep the current status quo in place. And of course, it's not only a work that is done by political theorists, it's also done by other social scientists. I think sometimes investigative journalism is part of the picture here, because it's really difficult to get into those circles. But for understanding why we currently don't see, or we see far too little change in terms of economic structures, even though all the injustices and the lack of democracy and all these things are so well known, I think exploring why that is and where the obstacles come from is really part of the story. And then the indifferent, by that I mean people who don't really have strong reasons to be for or against certain proposals, who might go along with others if the proposals are there. But where it's also important to understand what would convince them. So to make this concrete, when one thinks about workplace democracy, which is a philosophical proposal that has taken up a lot of speed recently in discussions. So it can take various forms. You have worker cooperatives, but you also have co-determination, team-based decision-making structures, elected bosses, all kinds of models that could be applied to companies and other workplaces to give workers more voice, and thereby also to take them seriously as citizens, but also at the workplace. For that proposal, people have now started to do also surveys among the general population. Would people actually like this? And we had lots of studies in the beginning that looked at the good, so the successful models of, what works, what doesn't. And there's also some research on the bad, in the sense of, for example, union busting, or companies acting against works councils in countries where works councils are actually mandatory, but companies still fight against them. But there was also a study recently in, I think, the American Journal of Sociology that just did a big survey among Americans asking, what would you actually like? Would you like to have workplace democracy? And then, quite an important move, I think, would you also like workplace democracy if it came at a certain cost in terms of efficiency, and then ultimately also wages? And there was still quite a vast majority of people, and interestingly also from both Republican and Democratic voters, who were in favor of more democratic workplaces. And so I think in the end, for that kind of work, the grounded approach with the pioneers is crucial for showing what's possible and exploring how you could, spread out certain successful models from niches into the mainstream. But ideally, I think it should be embedded into these other more sort of systemic approaches. And it's very much a matter of collaborations. I've gone over to co-authoring far more than is usually done in philosophy, just because these are things where I often want to collaborate with the sociologists or organizational theorists. But I think that's something to be welcomed, and one learns so much in the process. So I think the whole movement towards grounded and ethnographically sensitive work is also an invitation to work with other academics who share this idea that, what we do is not just for other academics, it's ultimately for our societies. And so also we need to take societal actors seriously and understand what really motivates them. I think I should stop here. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Lisa. This was kind of the core of the project again. We're probing central principles of society rather than taking them for granted, and the proof lies in the practice. And we really appreciate your work there, which was always cutting edge even before we started this project. So we are really pleased to have you in the book and also here at the workshop. And I think the next presenter has just joined. Paul, Mr. Leides, would you like to take the floor? Welcome.
Hi. My apologies for being late, but it's a great pleasure to be here with you all. And I just want to thank Brooke and the whole editorial team for bringing this project to fruition. I think this is so needed in political theory. Um, and I guess I'll just take my time to talk a little bit about the approach to critical theory that I write about in the chapter that I've contributed here. So I talk here about an approach that I call critical popular research, which is just a way of kind of denoting a strategy for incorporating ethnographic work into critical theory. Um, Sometimes when I talk about the kind of research that I do that involves grounded empirical inquiries together with critical readings of texts, uh, friends, colleagues kind of scratch their heads and say, "Why would you do that? Why not just read the text? You don't have to make it so hard, Paul." I think that there are interesting reasons about the why question that go back to the very origins of like critical theory with capital C, capital T. I'm thinking about Theodore W. Adorno, oddly, because he certainly didn't do ethnography. But in the early Frankfurt School, there was a clear commitment to doing research that was interdisciplinary, that brought philosophy together with psychoanalysis and with empirical social scientific inquiries, flawed though many of their experiments in this direction were. But there was a real interest in incorporating lived experience into the very, fabric, the muscle of theory. And I've been trying to do this in a way that focuses on the lived experiences of politicized communities of working people, and thinking about how the thoughts, the ideas that people have as they are engaged in struggle can be brought into theory to invigorate theoretical concepts, and then how theory can go the other way as well. I've also been inspired by more recent writings. So I have a lot of respect for a book called The Gender of Critical Theory that was published a few years ago by Lois McNay, who is on the staff at Oxford. She writes in that book, quote, "An interpretive account of experience, direct subjective experience, ought to be a central element of a critical theory that seeks to directly address those oppressed groups who are the subjects of inquiry and aims thereby to make a practical contribution to their struggles for freedom." I would say that ethnography enables access to such direct subjective experience. I think that's a key word here. And it helps make good on critical theory's political commitment. So McNay also talks about the notion of dialogue, or dialogism, as she puts it in the book. And this speaks to something that Lisa was just saying too. McNay writes, "Dialogism implies that knowledge validation is a cooperative endeavor, where the theoretical and experiential perspectives work towards mutual improvement and expansion of thought." I take this to mean, in a nutshell, that as theorists who might be inclined to do ethnography, we ought to be doing research with people in the field, not on them. In the chapter that I contribute to the collection, I talk about five concrete ways to nourish this kind of presence of dialogue in political and critical theory that has some kind of investment in ethnography. Um, First, I talk about co-creating the field research instruments and the protocols with the people about whom you want to write. And second, letting the theoretical ideas and problems that define your project emerge through your interactions in the field, even as you engage in academic spheres of discourse. A third part of my proposal is to participate in the community in ways that are not directly instrumental to your research. This is something my students sometimes, especially cotton on to. Fourth, I write about adapting your own theoretical approach to the intellectual culture of the people with whom you're conducting the project. And fifth, it's a way of kind of balancing what tends to be a present day focus or even presentism in an ethnographic inquiry with an incorporation of theories, more historical analysis of race and capitalism. So talk briefly about each of these points, and then we can go to the rest of the discussion. But, in the first 2 points, my thought is that if we let ourselves be guided by desire for dialogue, then we want to devise research practices that really are collaborative and demonstrate the value of reciprocity. I've done this in the past by co-designing field research procedures and tools together with migrant worker organizations when I've been doing research with these groups. I would just say that this means making some sacrifices that political theorists can be loath to make, because it means that you have to give up a degree of control over the main concepts and problematics in your project. And that can feel strange and uncomfortable for academics, like theorists, or like really any academics, who are mostly used to spinning out arguments with complex analytical architectures pretty much on our own. Um, an example of this, so I wrote a book a few years ago that was about migrant day laborers in the United States, mostly Latino workers. And I wanted my interviews initially to include questions about the workers, not just their work experiences, which I was very interested in, um, but also their personal migration histories. My previous field work with migrant workers had showed that there were really important connections between people's struggles to cross the border and establish themselves newly in the United States, and the ways that they approached conflicts, stresses, and dangers, dangerous working conditions on their jobs. However, when I posed this possibility to the day labor centers where I was doing the research, the organizers were unanimous. They're like, you cannot ask people about their migrant histories. These people are too recently arrived. And even though, I was, becoming known around the worker centers and participating in communities, they're just not going to trust you enough to give you, a reasonably full account. And we don't want to pressure them to talk about these migration experiences. So I was like, okay, so we decided to refocus together, I mean, the organizers and I, to refocus the questions more narrowly on the workers' experiences of day labor jobs and building politicized communities through the workers' centers. This actually, had a kind of positive result. I think one of the things that's so exciting about doing field work is that your theoretical interests gradually dawn on you in ways that you can't anticipate as you participate in the daily local activities. I think for me, that's a real strong draw away from this desk from where I'm talking to you and where we do our writing and into the field. So I didn't know the book I wrote was ended up being called The Fight for Time because the theme of time constantly came up in the workers' comments about what it was like, for example, to go many days without being hired or just to wait for long hours out on the street corner, hoping that someone would drive by and take them off to suburban Seattle or wherever to go do construction work or yard work. But then, the book then became that generated an interest in current critical theories about temporality and working life and precarity in contemporary society. Um, I also want to say, though, that I think the fieldwork naturally leads you to respect the fact that we're not looking for that kind of empirical endeavor to foster a seamless, academically productive interaction between theoretical reflection and conversations in a concrete context. This is that third point that I was making there. I think that for fieldwork to really generate the kinds of relationships that nourish these sorts of collaborations, we've got to be open to contributing to the communities of people in which we get involved in ways that just are not so instrumentally related to our research goals, at least not directly. So, for example, when I was writing this book, I was volunteering at these worker centers in Seattle, taking phone calls to dispatch workers to jobs, or in Portland, where I was teaching English classes. But I also helped out with odd needs like acting in a sort of theater activity naturally as the employer who was mistreating workers and handing out name tags and stuff like that. So I think this is important because it helps you when you're not so in the mode of being instrumentally involved in collecting data and, getting what you need, the material you need. It helps you reflect critically about your own position vis-a-vis the persons and the groups that you're trying to understand. Um, for me personally, for example, gaining some level of trust is always going to be an issue with Latino migrant workers because I'm a white American guy with elite university credentials and all the advantages that citizenship and, a command of the English language bring with that too. Um, it just when you're in the midst of the relationship, it reminds us that ethnographic relationships are always shaped by power, that power is relational and that we need to engage, not ignore its dynamics. So just a couple more points and I'll finish up. I mentioned the fourth way to foster dialogue in the research process is to let your method be shaped by the community's own intellectual culture. And I think you have to keep your eyes open and ears open for these kinds of continuities in the intellectual life of the group with which you're interacting. In the case of Day Laborers, that was like this very kind of organic commitment to a notion of popular education drawn from Paulo Freire. Many of you probably know his 1969 book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Uh, and that's just kind of like basic material for political organizing and political education in the day labor community in the United States, and really from many Latin American organizations in other parts of the Americas. But you know, the notion of dialogue resonates there as well. Freire conceives of dialogue as the key means through which social critique from society's edges emerges and acquires political force. And so, what I'm talking about when I write about critical popular research in the piece for this volume is a way to fold into the methods of critical theory the processes of identifying and revising what Freire called generative themes, really stand out sort of emotionally and sensorially provocative elements of language in people's vernacular expressions about their social experiences. And I think this is what I'm saying we ought to be shooting for as critical theorists. If we go back to this notion of direct experience that Lois McNay talks about, is, you know, concretely it's working with language that really works for people on the ground to talk about their situated experiences of power and struggle, and then bringing that into conversation with concepts that we derive, you know, from our academic sources, whatever they might be. Then the last thing that I wanted to say was just, and I want to thank Brooke actually for pushing me in this direction to expand the, you know, the project or the conception of critical popular research here. It speaks to the fact that it's, even though, you know, you may have contact with the sort of present manifestations of the intellectual culture of the group, there still is a kind of a gravitational pull, I would say, in this kind of work towards looking at the present moment. And because that's what people are talking about when they're expressing their experiences of work, of political struggle, of organization forming. I think a necessary corrective to that is to take what you gain through these exercises in ethnography and pass them through the lens or the prism, if you will, of studies of racial capitalism. And because this is the way that we can expand the historical and spatial horizons of ethnographically grounded critical theory in lots of ways. In the chapter, I talk about Du Bois actually as offering a model for that in a couple of his writings. So that's kind of a snapshot, or in a nutshell, choose your metaphor, of what I'm writing about in this chapter. I'm just delighted to be part of this group, and I really want to thank everybody for their contributions.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, Paul, for making the time joining us from London, I think, today, right? I really like the way that you mentioned that theoretical interest eventually dawns on you through interaction between with people in the field. I think one couldn't probably summarize grounded and engaged normative theory in a better way. So we're really, really glad to have you in the book. And I open the floor for discussion now for people who are joining us via Zoom. Could you raise your hands if you want to, and then in the room, just give me a sign whether you wanted to contribute or share an observation. Yes. Please go ahead.
Thank you.
Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, sure. So, hi everyone. I'm Jibu Lana. I'm a lecturer at Griffith University. So by training, I'm an anthropologist, but I do have my PhD in public health. So currently I study for the work with anthropology and public health, and I try to introduce myself as a public health anthropologist. Anyway, I have a quick question, for the last presentation, Paul. So I was just wondering about your 5-step. Are you also considering about co-writing within this 5-step? So I was quickly, reviewing your chapter, and I believe you started with, the co-design idea, within this ethnographic thing. So within your, 5-step idea, do you also, considering about the co-writing, like the co-authorship of your, participant?
Yeah, I've thought about that. I mean, I did. I haven't. I think that's something I would aspire to do that I haven't really done yet. Although I did. One thing that came out of this project with Day Laborers was not just an academic book and academic articles, which are solely authored, even though like the process I would say was dialogical in coming up with the analysis and the interpretation and the themes. But I did actually also produce I wrote a document with the organizers of the worker centers. It was a kind of a manual for popular education seminars or exercises that could be done with workers at day labor centers that drew on what the workers themselves had articulated in the context of this project. So, for example, there was a popular education session that we did on the basis of this research where I took some of this one theme that workers talked about. So, day labor is really dangerous work. Like if you're doing a day labor, you never know who you're going to work for. And they may be, a kind of nice liberal Seattleite who treats you really well and feels really guilty about hiring you and they make you coffee. And they may be just someone who doesn't want to do a dangerous job and wants you to hurt your back, not them. And so workers were talking about this contradiction that I had noticed, and I sort of fed back to them. I said, people are saying at the same time that there's risk on all sides. That was a key phrase there. And that the only way to respond is to keep your eyes wide open and basically protect yourself against harm because no one else is going to protect you. And the contradiction there is that they feel such a, economic need for the work that they have to, they take on risks even though that they know that they shouldn't. So the problem was how should you respond? And then out of this popular education session arose a new idea that I hadn't thought of and they hadn't either, but that was to try to organize the employers. So it was a really interesting. And now they haven't gotten very far on that, but at least the idea came up, and so that was a kind of co-authorship there that I think really worked. Was putting together this other resource. It wasn't written in academic language, um, but it was, I think, an integral part of the academic work, slash community and political work.
Well, thank you. Since there's no other question, I take the opportunity to ask the question as a chair. I have a question for Simon Kim and Lisa Hansel. We really liked how you kind of zoom into the practice, but can you both tell us something about what your perception of the kind of the larger world order is in which this is happening? I mean, now we hear everywhere that the liberal international order is dead, whatever the United Nations Charter order is dead. So what does your research kind of contribute towards kind of which kind of order are we going? Do you have a concept of international order in the back of your mind as you are conducting your research? Maybe Lisa, did you want to start?
Well, I'm not sure I have a concept of international order, but I do have some ideas about, a future economic model, which I label economic democracy because I want to get away from unhelpful dichotomies that are just blurring the debate and serving the status quo. Um, and I can't speak so much to the international dimensions. Maybe someone can do this. What I see a lot is that so there are two things that people in my field of work are struggling with these days. One is this idea that somehow our research would inform the public, and then, Habermasian slouses, like it would feed into parliamentary debate, and 5 years later you get a new law. This idea is just not what we have anymore. And it would be totally naive to think that by publishing research, you would already, even get noticed in public discourse. So there are quite a few questions about how to get the word out there, how to connect to different types of actors, and also what kind of communication is actually the right one for the kind of project you're doing, because the illiberal forces are using a lot of emotional and hate-driven communication. So if we think of the other camp that wants to defend democratic values and expand them, what kind of communication is right for us? So this is something where I think there are also lots of ethical questions of what is the role of researchers in relation to different communities that are extremely under pressure these days. And, is it our task to, yeah, to put it very simply, to amplify the voice of labor unions, for example. And sometimes when I got invited to speak for them, I felt that they invited me because they wanted their voice to be amplified. And I was sort of, is that what I should do? But yeah, maybe it is. I don't know. So I think the communication and outreach side, and how does that kind of research inform public and political discourse, this has become a whole issue of its own. And then in terms of what kind of change is possible, I mean, I wanted to raise that question also for Paul and Sangmon, so I'd be interested to hear your thoughts as well. When I give public talks on workplace democracy or economic democracy or some of these themes, inevitably these days there will be a student in the audience who says, "You're so naive, this will not happen without a revolution." And 5 years ago, it was still always one audience member asking about UBI as the one-size-fits-all solution. These days, there's much more interest in radical change. And what I then tell them is, look, these kinds of alternative practices, we need to understand them better, either for some kind of more democratic, peaceful transition to happen, or for knowing what to do after a revolution. And then you get this idea of prefiguration. If some kind of revolution comes, I don't think we can theorize this or really anticipate this theoretically. But if, let's say, windows of opportunity open up, what are our societies going to do in terms of just more just economic structures? And so this kind of prefigurative experimental work together with actors on the ground, I think it has a point whether you believe reform is still possible in democratic societies, or as much as they're still democratic, or whether you think there will be some kind of major system break. I'll stop here. Great question.
Thank you.
Difficult question.
So, Kim, what you maybe
Yeah.
final contribution yet?
Oh, well,
Thank you.
I haven't thought very deeply about what East Asian political theories do in the larger context of world order. But just off my head, one of the again the for the past 20 years, one of the most vibrant research questions among East Asian political theorists and beyond has been Confucian political meritocracy, which has been, echoed by a lot of, anti-democratic theories, still, champions of epistocracy and, in the West as well. So whenever we have in mature liberal democracy in North America and especially Western Europe, we have struggles with populism, all kinds of, the return of authoritarianism, all kind of problems. And then now we are revisiting, the meaning and practice of representative democracy, whether democracy is in crisis, how can we overcome crisis, and that invites us to think about a variety of kinds of ways to go beyond, democratic system or democratic theory as such. And that one of the ways to do this was to pay renewed and close attention to this possibility of a political meritocracy ruled by the elite, ruled by the best and brightest. We cannot trust people who can be myopically self-interested and ill-informed, and uneducated, and lacking in public responsibility. And we want to trust the power to the people who are well qualified to rule for the majority of people. And that insight is hard to advocate in the familiar Western liberal context because we are all students of Habermas, Kant, Locke. It's very difficult to openly argue for that kind of alternative system. Well, then we have people from China, Singapore, Hong Kong, different parts of the world talking about the voter ignorance and all kinds of problem can associate with the people. Then we can go for a different type of political theory that we think, at least some people think, can provide us with a new avenue through which political theory can be revitalized. I think there is danger. Because if you talk about it, I mean, many Western political theorists, especially liberals, and believe it or not, are very attracted to this idea of virtue. I mean, I don't have any problem with virtue, but virtue politics and elitism and epistocracy and meritocracy. But if you talk about that in East Asia, if you go to Taipei or Seoul or Tokyo, very few students or young people would be happy to hear about that, because that doesn't ring with you. That doesn't resonate with what the young East Asian people believe is the case to make their public political life better. So we have this, in global intellectual arena, we tend to think, well, in order to give justice to unfamiliar voices coming from non-Western part of the world. Okay, political meritocracy, whatever. I mean, that's fashionable, that's interesting, and it's hard for us to talk about, but these people talking about as if their ideas have a great fan base in the region. That's not the case, actually. We sometimes, present some ideas that are not actually supported by the local people in a way that can promote your intellectual career, or job search. Anyhow, so the global crisis democracy doesn't have to necessarily champion or support the attempt to suddenly overcome the democratic practices and systems. Rather, there are a lot of things that a lot of middle grounds we need to pay attention to, and sometimes scholars in the West, both scholars in the West and scholars in this part of the world, sometimes don't have patience to navigate in this very difficult terrain, and rather they jumped into these new ideas and then presenting that as if that's the idea that we should go for. Anyhow, I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Let's give the panel a hand. Thank you. I think I have about 10-minute break or 15-minute.
Yeah, so
What?
we have two different time zones here. We kind of need to start on time, actually, because of all of the schedule. So please, those of you online, feel free to stay with us, run away and come back. But I realize all this virtualness is difficult. For those of you in the room, feel free to run away right now. We'll resume at the bottom of the hour, anticipating probably a few technical difficulties as folks come on. Thank you so much for being our launch conversation. We look forward to having John back shortly, and then our other presentations are actually in the room. Thank you very much for getting us started today, despite our technical difficulties.
That was great, you guys. You're doing amazing work. Really something. Really something.
Yeah,
Well,
great.
without you, it wouldn't have been possible.
Thank you for everyone, and also the organizers in the background. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Your contributions are great, and this is a super first panel. Thank you.
Thank you all. I'm so sorry to be late again, you all.
Welcome back, everybody. Those of you online can see that you definitely got the conversation launched in the room and in the hallways. Thank you very much. We're gonna see if we can, I don't know if you know how this works. We have an OWL camera. And you may have noticed in the previous session, it's a predilection for zooming in on its own, and that can be a wonderful quality. But sometimes it grabs the screen or something you don't want. So please forgive us. Occasionally, the lovely Elena will be muting the OWL or trying to bring it under control. Hopefully, because we have two presentations in the room, actually, we won't have quite the same difficulty that we did in the last one in terms of having the distraction of the OWL, but Paul and Lisa, who had the greatest effect of the roaming eye of the OWL, if you will handle it quite well. So thank you for that. Welcome back, everybody. That was a really great launch, and I think as we move into this conversation about really the last session sort of set up the question of who the we is and how a political theorist can use grounded and engaged normative theory, as Lisa points out, by any name to help us think about who we are theorizing with and for and why. And this conversation in this next panel, which we've described as about deliberation and participation, are going to move us further in thinking about that. So from the room, we're going to start first with Jan, whose work has been on climate change and decolonial perspectives, and his contribution to the handbook furthers both of those agendas. So I give it to you, Jan.
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for organizing this and having me as part of this really nice workshop and roundtable. It has really been a pleasure also to contribute to the handbook, to invite me to rethink and think about my work, and also to engage in a discussion. So that's how I kind of saw also my work in on this chapter, to think about my work thus far on climate justice and how I researched climate justice and global climate governance. It's the focus here is, and that's also why the paper or the contribution is called Grounded in a Changing Climate: Knowledge Production and Struggles for Just Climate Futures, because the chapter really focuses on the challenge of knowledge production. And I think that on the one hand, grounded normative theory is a great invitation and a great perspective to think about the struggles for knowledge production on the one hand, and on the other hand, like all, you would say, all governance issues or other aspects, climate governance and climate change is really the aspect where knowledge production is a big challenge, and for many reasons. So I think the relationship between knowledge production and climate governance and climate justice really matters a lot, broadly speaking, but also if we talk about grounded normative theory. I mean, you can say that in many fields, knowledge production is never neutral. It's always infused with power. We see that in a lot of different fields at the moment. We see that in the field of climate change, but also in other fields, we have cyber attacks on the knowledge production of climate change. We have a state-organized attack on the storation of climate data in the United States, for example, in the moment. But we also see a lot of attacks on knowledge production when it comes to different fields, also in Europe and Germany, where we don't have this ideal situation anymore, where we can simply talk about issues in a that Lisa, I think, mentioned already, in a way that is free from kind of the outside. So this is really where in which I see this chapter situated. And in the chapter, as I said, I developed kind of a dialogue. So a dialogue between the literature on climate justice that exists. And I make on the one hand, the argument that grounded normative theory can already learn quite some points from this literature, while also making its own contribution in developing things further. And in the chapter, I make several points, and three I would like to highlight. And one, of course, sounds maybe kind of clear, which is learning from local communities, which I think we already learned and heard about in other contexts as well. It sounds maybe obvious, but we already heard from Paul how challenging that can be to do, actually. The challenge is also to think about and rethink what kinds of knowledge are we actually want to explore, and how are these forms of knowledge basically held by affected people, right? So There are historical, practical, relational, place-based forms of knowledge, and they are given and distributed within and across communities in different cases. And then, of course, there is this big tension between how we understand climate change, often in models and abstract numbers and terms, versus really lived experiences. And this tension is not easily resolved because we need both, right? So, and also in the next days, we will have a workshop on that. So the question is also, how do we actually generate knowledge in the light of physical events that are happening and that are disruptions for social relations, cultural practices, livelihood, and so on and so forth. So that's one thing. And then one point here is that working or researching or learning from local communities is not just there to, that's not just a nice add-on, right? It's not just, because we think it's valuable to do so, but the point here is really, I would argue that we need it, right? So in order to produce also better knowledge, quote unquote, we really need to engage with the experience of local communities, especially if we want to engage with issues such as sustainable adaptation and so on and so forth. So in that sense, I think grounded normative theory tells us and can inform us how working on climate justice is not just empirical or normative, but it's really both. And it has a really a deeper value in doing the research because it can inform us also what matters to people if we, for example, thinking about adaptation to climate change. Second point is the grounded perspectives, I would say, reveal also the connections between inequality and responsibility. So also here, working with people in the fields is not just to think about, and also here Lisa mentioned some important points that resonate very much with my work, is not just to see people kind of in their field, in their immediate context, but of course at the same time identify the larger political, social, and economic context in which people are acting, but also subject to power dynamics and inequalities. So the question here is, how or the task, I would say, to integrate these larger historical political dynamics that produce the inequalities in which that or generated the situation for people they are in now. And also then in turn having this normative aspect, okay, so really also focus on the question of responsibility. And one important aspect here, or good example, I would say, is of course the example of loss and damage that affected people have in the negotiations so long struggled for and only got to some few minor steps in the last 2 or 3 years. So so grounded perspectives are here crucial to go beyond the easily quantified harm, so to speak, right? But also really go beyond this idea that loss and damage is just an economic dimension, but there's also a cultural and social dimension. Last but not least, of course, knowledge hierarchies. That's something I have focused in the chapter on, the hierarchies and the politics of knowledge production. So as I said already in the beginning, this tension between kind of the idea that knowledge very much in the IPCC and UNFCCC context informs policy making, and that is a real challenge and a real challenge for a lot of affected people. We see now that the IPCC has organized workshops on diverse ways of knowing, included indigenous knowledge. But of course, still the question is how does that translate basically into politics? And I think that grounded normative theory is a great perspective to focus basically on the question of epistemic justice. And I think I already talked quite a bit, but just making 2 points here for like further topics I would see also from this work and from the handbook, also from reading a few other chapters here. It's climate justice and climate governance is a context where you see that knowledge production and the politics of knowledge gets really complicated, because now we see that some countries in the global south, countries like Saudi Arabia, directly attack IPCC and other forums with the claim, with the argument, it's not just. And they have a fair point, of course, but they don't do that, of course, because they want to replace it with a more just perspective, but because they, of course, see that negotiating advantage in the multilateral regime. So I think here we again have to see kind of the colonial dimension of the state-centric apparatus of managing and governing climate change. And I think that's one aspect where I think that this perspective of decolonial climate justice and grounded normative theory can be very valuable. So thank you for
Thank you. Thanks very much. So far today, our examples and our engagement has either been directly with empirical research that has been qualitative or general about lived experience and what people think. Thank you. And we're now switching to John Parkinson, who has a methodology that enables us to explore qualitative data at a large scale. And we wonder what that contributes to the field. So John, take it away.
Hey, thanks, Brooke. I hope you can hear me clearly. I'm talking through some
Pretty
Bluetooth
clearly.
things. Yep, all good. Great. Fantastic. So thanks very much for having me. And this has been an interesting journey. I mean, we first I started joining this conversation, gosh, nearly 10 years ago. And it's really interesting to see how this has developed over the time. Look, my chapter's kind of slightly odd. It's one of those ones where I'm always having an argument with myself. I don't need anybody else to tell me I'm wrong. And if I'd been sort of doing this now, I might have sort of slightly changed the framing of it, because on the surface it looks like a methods paper. It's really not. It's trying to explore. It uses a methodological discussion to get in at something else. At 2 other things. And I just want to talk about that very briefly. So on the one hand, it's about these issues of how we get at qualitative issues, meaning making at scale. When there's an abundance of qualitative information available to us, that's more than we can handle by going deep, by going ethnographically, by working with specific communities and specific places. And that was partly why when we were doing the project we were in, my co-author is Nuria Franco-Guillem, who's the Open University of Catalonia in Barcelona. And when we first started getting into this stuff, it was just at the start of the development of some particular tools for gathering very large amounts of qualitative data. And when I say very large, I've been working with a database of 1 million pieces of communication on the Scottish independence referendum of 2014, and another database of around 45,000 pieces of communication in a case of recognising Indigenous peoples in the Constitution in Australia, and trying to make sense of that. But it's grounded. The approach is grounded in a set of concerns about the way in which deliberative and participatory Democrats have been taking theory as a set of templates for acting in the world, and to me missing something because of their normative commitments. So let me just sort of say something about that very, very briefly. There's a wonderful if you're interested in this stuff, there's a wonderful book by a guy called Antonio Floridia, who looks at the history, the recent history, the last 60 years of participatory and deliberative practices, deliberative theorizing and deliberative academic study. And it's really interesting. But one of the things that people have done is starting with Jürgen Habermas, they've taken a set of theories which are about how democratic communication relates to lawmaking and everyday life, everyday normative activity. And instead of sort of thinking of that as a broad theory of how democratic communication works, it's been taken as a template for how democratic practice ought to be designed. And we've moved from this very, very large scale concern to a kind of administration of deliberative democracy, the design of processes which allow us to get people involved to co-produce decisions. But the framework in which that's happened is always set by the commissioning body. It's always set by the governors, the governments, the agencies, the local people who set up the consultation process. And we felt that this is missing an enormous amount. One of the things that it's missing is that people themselves don't need to be put in a deliberative mini-public in order to deliberate. We do this all the time. We just have to look around us. We see people arguing about politics, about justice, about rights, but not necessarily doing it in a very seminary way or necessarily doing it in a terribly designed way. And so what we wanted to get at was a sense of, to try to understand this, to capture it by using a set of big data techniques to get at this very dispersed conversation. Now, out of that came two things. The first thing that we found is that kind of beyond our expectations, way beyond our expectations, people don't just shout at each other online and call each other names. They're not just trolling each other. They're not just backing each other into corners. Online, people are spending roughly 15 to 20% of their time talking about how to talk about politics. They're talking about the norms of and establishing ways of talking about problems and the things that divide us, the things that divide them. They're talking about the processes by which you make arguments with each other in online settings. Some of those are quite deliberative, but it varies enormously from place to place, and it varies by not just by culture, it varies by what we think is state structure. So the way in which states are organized or not to capture, involve, include local perspectives, or to compartmentalize them or just to ignore them is very, very important. And one of the lessons we've drawn from this, and it's less clear in the paper, is that strangely enough, a relatively exclusive state is better than a very inclusive one. A very inclusive one tends towards corporatism. It tends to co-opt and structure the public sphere into the state and thus dominate the civil society. Whereas one that doesn't try sort of encourages a flowering of civil society organizations, which then independently press their demands on the state. And in that kind of environment, you get this enormous flourishing. And in the Scottish case is one of these ones of vibrant public debate. And we've used that, I guess, to push back against a lot of deliberative democracy, which says we can only get these kinds of values coming through properly designed and managed processes that deliberative democrats have themselves involved in. And this goes to crazy extent. There's been a recent book on deliberative theory that is subtitled Democracy When the People Are Thinking, as if they don't usually. And we, just from our own evidence, we just think this is an unjustified denigration of popular capacities. And we get this through big data techniques. Some of what we say, some of what we did is very much of its time. So we began this research, goodness, just over 10 years ago now. And a lot has changed in the world of digital techniques. A lot has changed in terms of our access. So if you might remember, some of you will be aware of what was called the Cambridge Analytica scandal, where a company was working for political parties, scraping up large amounts of online data, detecting patterns in that, but selling that onto political parties for campaigning purposes. In the wake of that, access was closed down unless you paid for it. And this has essentially eliminated a whole lot of academic research using these kinds of tools. But we think that this is why perhaps the precise methods are less important here than the general lesson, which is to take people's ordinary everyday communication seriously and listen to how they are talking, not just what they are saying, but how they're managing these kinds of large-scale conversations. That then changes our way of thinking. It changed our way of thinking about deliberative theory in lots of ways, but it kind of pushed us back in some ways to a very early Habermasian view that looked at I guess the pragmatist conditions of communication and the way that communities make meaning together in situations of power relations, in situations of domination, certainly in situations of injustice, but also, people do act as co-producers of this stuff, and it's our job to listen to that and not just to pretend we can facilitate it and make it happen.
Yeah, there you go. Excellent. Well done. Okay, so take note, everybody. That's how to do time. My goodness, Mr. Zoom user. For those of you who were joining late, that was John Parkinson, aka Zoom user. So thank you. Next, we have another co-authored paper whose co-author is represented by, or whose co-authorship is represented by Richard Foster here today. And again, using methods to help us think again about another interesting theoretical question. Take it away, Richie.
Great, thank you, and thank you for having me. So I'm just going to firstly start by talking about sort of my own experience teaching. So I teach on a Master of Public Policy course, and one of the questions I always get asked by my students, who are typically civil servants or advocates or politicians, is what does this political philosophy stuff mean to me? How does this relate to the people which we're working for? And I have always been struggling to point them in sort of a single direction. And so I'm very glad that the handbook is now here as the place I can point them to show them how political philosophy relates to them and can be related to people's sort of everyday lived experiences. So I'll start us off. I think John has introduced mini publics as a paradigm that he's been arguing against. I'm going to briefly defend them and say that they do have some issues which I think we've been trying to resolve with our chapter, and I'll talk about how experiments can sort of improve deliberation. So deliberative mini publics are these sort of institutionalized spaces where people can come together and talk about important political issues and engage in collective decision making under what is ideally, as John said, conditions of political equality. And quite unsurprisingly, when you have inequality within the wider society and you bring people into a room together, those inequalities don't just disappear, right? And I mean, this claim has been made by plenty of scholars. I mean, we have people like Iris Marion Young and Lenny Sanders who draw on sort of real world examples to highlight how these inequalities might manifest in deliberation. And I'll give you some examples. So what we're interested in and what we talk about in our chapter is how women and racialized participants in deliberation become sort of structurally disadvantaged. This isn't because people are reasoning any worse, right? This is because the conceptions of what sort of good deliberation is, they're favoring sort of white male financially well-off speakers. So my example is always, I'm from the north of England. So whenever I'm in a room with other Brits, they can hear my sort of accent, right? And they think, oh, he's a northerner. He doesn't really know what he's talking about. But we've got this sort of stereotype of the northerners being a little less intelligent, right? And so they don't see me as able to sort of deliberate as well. And this is the thing, right? That the people's characteristics can really affect how they're perceived by listeners and how their contribution to a deliberation is perceived. And the sort of experimental side of deliberative democracy offers us two big insights that sort of build on these claims that inequalities in sort of wider society can ruin political equality in these rooms, in these institutionalized deliberations. So firstly, we can use experiments to sort of elucidate how inequalities manifest. So we think about sort of variations in gender or race, for example. We can see how that affects the behaviors of both speakers and listeners. And so in one of my favorite experiments by Mendelberg, Tali Mendelberg and colleagues, they investigate how the number of women in a room and the decision rule that concludes deliberation, so sort of majority rule or unanimity rule, affects the behavior of men. And they find that men tend to sort of interrupt more under a majority rule rather than under a unanimity rule, right? While finding that rule would not affect the behavior of women in this way whatsoever. And so that gives us a sort of insight as to how these inequalities manifest themselves. And then on the other side, we can also use experiments to start to think how we might try to neutralize these inequalities in deliberation. So in another experiment, there is the introduction of a sort of supermajority decision rule instead of a simple majority, which helps produce a sort of more inclusive deliberation where there's less bad behaviors like interruption that go on. And so in our chapter, we hone in on one experiment that's performed by my co-author, Afsina Sahi, at the University of British Columbia, where she had, and I can't claim to be involved in any of this experiment, and I apologize if I get something wrong here. But she had 40 participants who deliberated on religious arbitration in British Columbia, where she split these into a control group and two groups which are each given a sort of facilitated intervention. So the first one being a deliberative work exercise where people would rate each other on good deliberative behavior. So that might be did the other person interrupt you or not? And rate them 5 stars on their non-interrupting behavior, right? And a simulated representation exercise where people defend each other's views before, before they actually engage in deliberation. They start to defend the other side, as it were. And the ultimate sort of finding is that these interventions would change how people perform. So this deliberative work exercise effectively gamifies non-interruption, which I think is like a fantastic little finding. And it ended up stopping men from interrupting, and therefore we have a better deliberation, and we've sort of neutralized this inequality, as it were. And this showed that look, these mini publics aren't perfect, but through sort of engagement with looking at how inequality manifests itself and what we can do about that, we can really improve institutionalized deliberation. And so I'm cautious of time here, so maybe I'll press on. But we then talk a little bit about how deliberative democracy has lots of sort of empirical studies. So we have things like observational studies, surveys, network analysis, and sort of big data work as John was doing. And so it's not just sort of causal interventions that we'd be looking at. So, but what we do is we end up developing a data sensitive theory of deliberative democracy, which draws on the principles of grounded and engaged normative theory. So firstly, we're very much sort of bottom up, right? So we're building theory from evidence about how deliberation really works, not what, as John said, not what it looks like in the ideal case. The second point is non-universalism. So we're accepting that what's normatively feasible varies immensely by context, and that some messiness, like strategic speech, when people try to sort of use little tricks in their speech to win a point, and that's unavoidable. And sometimes you can actually harness that. And then we also talk about comparative inquiry. So we think that sort of data sensitive theory of deliberative democracy should be drawing on findings across several studies and settings to really strengthen and start to generate more sort of generalizable conclusions. And so yeah, I really think that this experimental approach, although it is not a sort of co-production endeavor necessarily, and that's a real sort of concern with that I have with some of the deliberative democracy literature in general. But I think that the experiments can really try to really engage with people's sort of lived experiences and be able to bring to surface what inequality looks like in deliberation and how we might fix that.
Perfect, thank you. So I'll open it up to the audience online and in the room, and I'll just summarize a little bit to spark everybody's thinking. We had Jan start us off by asking about or raising the issue of the politics of knowledge, and that knowledge is never neutral. And as John pointed out, we have way more ways of thinking about and finding data that we might think about. But as Richard's raising, and maybe because I'm highly influenced by having just read Karen Howe's book, Empire of AI, as time goes on from when John did his work, it is hard for us to know exactly what algorithms created that data set that we are now trying to learn from, and what techniques can we use to be data sensitive, but also to be sensitive about the data sources. So it's a pretty spicy panel that you all have put in the room today, and I'll just invite the room to join in. Yes, Labib.
I have a quick question regarding, John's presentation. I understand, you mentioned about two different data sets, and, and from your perspective, as we have more capacity with computing, so quantitative data might have more contextual information, and it's not only the number, and it's also provide the context. But I would like to know more about, the data collection procedure. So when we have, larger scale, data set, obviously we have this questionnaire set, and maybe the way we are collecting the data, that would not be that important, to complete a data set. Whereas, within a quality-based study, maybe we focus more with the process, of the data collection. So I would like to comment on that.
So sorry, the audio wasn't great then. So your question is about the data collection process and what the rights and wrongs and possibilities of that are to do with, especially about there are questions of data ownership as well that come up there, and the way in which data is being diverted into nefarious purposes. Have I got that right?
Might need to speak louder. The owl is grabbing the loudest voice, and I think he wasn't looking enough at you. Just speak up, he'll get you.
Oh, so I'll try again. So, I mean, I understand, you have a big data set, and with the latest computing, I mean, obviously we can have more contextual information from, the quantitative data set. But I would be more interested, to see the reflection, of the process when you would see the overall data collection procedure. It is not only about the number or the data, rather, the process of data collection would be really important with qualitative or ethnographic studies. So obviously data, important, but at the same time, how about the procedure of the data collection?
Okay, so I wasn't clear. There's no numbers in my data. It's not quantitative data, it's qualitative. It's a vast amount of conversations, communication, contributions to arguments. So there's, I mean, in some ways, sort of analyzing this kind of stuff is very familiar. I mean, we've been doing computerized qualitative analysis for decades now using Atlas TI, and corpus linguistics has been doing this kind of thing on quite large data sets for quite some time. I think part of the issue here is that we didn't just ask an AI model to go and generate it for us, right? There wasn't a sort of a great hoovering up of material that is then sort of analyzed in various opaque ways. What there is I'll freely admit there's a little bit of an ethical fudge here. So at the time when we generated all this stuff, 2015, and our get out of jail free card was that we only accessed public posts on publicly accessible sites. We didn't go into member-only forums. We didn't go into anything that was sort of hidden behind any kind of presumption of privacy. It was public communication on a public issue in public. So that, I don't know, I still feel like that argument works to a certain extent, especially if one is applying sort of public reason norms. This is, if we're going to eliminate those kinds of things, if we're going to expect some kind of full right on privacy about these things, then we have to think about, well, what's the nature of politics? Politics is about collectively deciding what to do and how to allocate resources. And if we're going to be democratic about that, then those things are done in public. And to then claim, oh, but hang on, that was a private conversation. Well, was it? So we need to have a better argument about that. And we need to sort of have a think about where that goes. I understand that the same techniques we use to generate the data scraping of large publicly available materials, we used We didn't use Python. We used a package from the R statistical environment to do it. There's a question about consent, but we don't ask that same question about someone standing up in Parliament. We don't ask that same question about protesters standing there holding signs. So I want to have a theory. I want to get into this sort of question about what's the difference between standing there outside Parliament shouting and waving a placard, and the difference between and yelling at each other or having a conversation in a public forum. Now, there might be questions about, these things can come back to bite individuals, but they come back to bite individuals now. We can take photos of a protest, and we can use image searching tools to identify those individuals. And certainly the state's doing that. The state is tracking people and attributing political opinions to them, and security services are using that right now. Now, if we think that's a bad idea, then that really challenges our whole story about what politics is, what democratic communication is. And that, I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm saying it's opening up a really, really interesting question. I'm not sure if that's answered what you were asking. I've answered your question by raising more questions. But
so I would follow up with that by trying to tie these projects together again, sort of as I did in my opening question. And so I want to hear more about, so Labib is an anthropologist, and when we do our work together, we spend a lot of time figuring out how to ask the right question, the question that will create the opportunity for us to learn the thing we want to learn from the data, from whatever somebody says. And we have the privilege of having done this work for so long that we can even go back and be like, we understood this. Is that what you understood? So our conventional, let me call them conventional qualitative tools, conventional ethnographic tools, give us a whole panoply of ways that we can go back and at least be as sure as we are that we have understood the speech act, if you will, that the person was trying to give us. With your method of culling the data, there is an intermediary that I don't see represented in the chapter, and that is, actually there are two. That's the software that created the algorithm that made somebody's post visible to somebody else. So I posted something in public, as you say, on Reddit of all places. No, I didn't. But Monique, also not on Reddit. It fed into her queue and it fell into Kat's queue, but none of the men in the room had an algorithm that made them notice my post. Probably because they hadn't been following me previously, whatever. There were more clicks on that made it more visible to them than to the other people in the room. And just using that as like a microcosm. So there's two layers of interface before John Parkinson and team had a data set that they could cull from. And so I guess, I don't know if this is what Labib meant to be asking, but this is my question about it. How do you, as a researcher trying to interpret that data, get a handle on how that data set was actually created? Not the person who made the post. I agree with you on the ethics of how that person posted with the expectation of publicity and the fact that you were able to use it. I'm good with that. It's the other thing about how it ended up in a data set that could be culled at all, with the two intermediaries of the algorithm that somebody created and then the humans who created that algorithm, and you don't even know who those folks are or even what they were intending that algorithm to do when they wrote the algorithm, such that you ended up using a data set that was made visible by that.
Okay, I think so. Two responses to that. First of all, the big data work wasn't the only thing we did. Right? It's just it was just there to make a particular point in relative to grounded normative theory, which was to say you can find grounding in unlikely places. So what we actually did in addition to that was we did a great deal of archival work. We did a lot of interviews with campaigners and people who'd organized village hall meetings, people who had done electronic village halls. The Yes campaign in particular was very, very dispersed. We did a lot of just document analysis, a lot of reading. And we had an advisory group in both cases. In the Australian case, we had two Aboriginal only advisory boards who were advising us on cultural practices, the limits of what could and couldn't be used, access, explanations, and so forth. And they in particular were very, very interesting because they pushed back on the nothing about us without us rule, because in the context of colonial power relations, when the indigenous peoples are a tiny minority, nothing about us without us is oppressive. It demands so much time. It demands full-time engagement from people who have lives to lead and country to care for and family. And so they were quite happy for us to engage, generate what we generated, publish about it, but acknowledge the traditional owners and make acknowledgements of sovereignty over that. So that was interesting. The other point is the pre-filtering one. Now, the question there is what makes us think that we were seeing all there was to see, that there was not some kind of algorithmic pre-filtering to that. I don't know the detailed answer to that, but we thought about it. And if Nuria were here, she'd be able to tell you more about that. But there was never just one user. There was never just John Parkinson, white old guy, sitting there generating the stuff. But it was partly because of the way that Facebook was responsible for about 40% of our data. So it was never the case that we were just doing a general scrape of Facebook. It was often hashtag focused, or we were going in and looking at specific groups that we knew, or specific pages that had been set up, and looking at everything that's on that page. So if you're a member of a group, you're seeing all comments. You could just choose particularly, but we were looking at everything that was going on a particular page that was talking about independence things, partly because of the nature of the campaign, right? These campaigns wanted everybody to see. They were very, very general. But I absolutely understand the point. So we were aware of that. We put some things in place we looked at things like Mumsnet, its parenting website, which had two-year-long threads on independence questions, specifically in order to get women's perspectives that weren't otherwise being captured. There's a entertainment website called Digital Spy, and they had 6 threads on independence issues on an entertainment news website, right? And again, so we're looking in all sorts of places in order to manage those kinds of tensions.
I think it's a very nice point, and it throws back to what Richard and Jan were raising actually about in terms of that politics of knowledge again. Your quick answer was triangulation. It wasn't the only method. And I wonder if you want to, maybe Jan, you want to talk a little bit about what kinds of methods would give you confidence? As I was reading your chapter, I was thinking, oh, not all Indigenous situations are similar enough, are they? The general critique, we can get it. But if we actually sat down to figure out methodologically, again, to Libby's question, how would you make sure you're getting a capacious enough view of the view? Anyway, so I throw to you now the same question, but from the opposite side. How do you know you've gotten a more inclusive view of relevant knowledges to the debates you're thinking about?
Yeah, I think that's really the biggest challenge, and I would argue also, I'm not sure if Paul is still here, that there is always a power relation between you as a researcher and the subject you research, and this dimension is certainly one dimension of that power relation, not just that the different positionalities, but of course that yeah, especially in qualitative research, you always have to make that decision. And working on the Middle East myself, it gets sometimes even more complicated, and certainly in other places on the world as well, where you can't simply access sometimes spaces, or that the people you would like to talk to, or who are important, are simply not there anymore. They haven't survived the trip through the Mediterranean Sea, so you and so on and so forth. So there is actually a context in which there is physically not the ability basically to account for all kinds of knowledge. And I think that's for me kind of a thing that we can only like when we talk now about publications, we can acknowledge that, but I think we cannot and we should not publish and talk in a way that we could eventually resolve this issue.
And Richard, do you want to jump in? Do you have a comment?
Yeah, I mean, I was actually going to maybe build on something John said, and maybe this discussion about how you, tease out what people are really thinking. So I usually do things like survey work, and I spend most of my time thinking about how do I word this question in a way that I can. It sounds really deceiving. I'm thinking, how can I trick them into saying the thing they actually think, right? And that's not what I mean. But how can you get people to give you the sort of most honest response, and sometimes it might even be a sort of latent thought that they're having, and so I think this is actually one of the problems with the experimental methods as well, where people self-censor quite a lot, and they don't want to give the impression that they're a bad person, and so they'll behave in a completely different way. And that's why I think that these other approaches, this is where the strengths are, right? That you can get a better idea of what people really are thinking, I guess.
Yeah, perfect. John, back to you.
Whoops. I just wanted to make a quick comment on that, the self-censorship idea, because of course, deliberative democracy is meant to be after that. So it's meant to be after that self-censorship. It's meant to be about what's sayable in public. And if I worry slightly if we are setting it up against, if we're doing an implicit comparison about from what people say and what they really think, then we're not being deliberative democrats anymore. Then we're being something else. And there's a whole literature on that. But I just thought it was interesting that you raised that, because there is in liberal democracy is very much an emphasis on the private preferences are the things that get expressed in the secrecy of the ballot box, but not in the public sphere.